some complaining at one time that the journal doesn't accept qualitative work. Not true. The journal accepts what is submitted. And there just wasn't a lot of qualitative work that was being submitted. But that's changing pretty radically. There's many faculty who really want to do very deep understanding of a small group of students, and not necessarily these big, large-scale quantitative kinds of studies. So either are acceptable. Another idea, and something that I noticed with many of the engineering education PhD students here at UTM, is people are using what's called mixed methods research. So it's a quantitative study with a subset that looks in much more detail, trying to understand more deeply from a subset. It's a very good idea. Someone got a hard time about the triangulation. They argued it's three things. Actually, it's often two things, quantitative and then one more qualitative in-depth work. But they publish both research investigations, which is the bulk of the articles, and then research reviews. There's a real need for what's called secondary research. We did a lot of this in cooperative learning, called a procedure called meta-analysis. We look at the hundreds of studies that have been done and try to make sense of them in a comprehensive way. And I think it's also an important area of research. The 6 review criteria for the journal are these. State clearly the questions or propositions, situate the research in relevant bodies of knowledge, and describe the so what, what's contribution. Employ research designs, methods, theories appropriate to the research performed. Present original ideas. This is especially the case at PhD level work. It has to be your ideas that are emerging, and it has to make some contribution. And provide a line of reasoning, compelling evidence, exhibit clear, concise, precise. And this is a challenge for many of the our international community, non-native English speakers. This is one of the challenge areas. But if it's good work, it won't prohibit the publication. It will just require some working with an editor to get it in a shape that is highly readable. And then, of course, provide the support from tables, figures, and other things that help the reader understand the work. Notice the parallelism between these review criteria and the scientific research in education. Those principles influence this set of review criteria. And another thing that's, I think, quite unique with the Journal of Engineering Education is they publish the review criteria. Take a look at the technical journals that you publish in, and look to see whether or not they tell you what they're looking for, in the review criteria. It's amazing the number of journals that don't list the criteria that they're using to review the work that's being submitted, which is, I think, very odd, but it's really common. Whereas this journal actually puts it out there and says, these are the criteria that we will use to review your article. This is the journal that I'm the editor-in-chief in. It's a secondary journal. It's distributed by the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship on Engineering Education at the National Academy of Engineering, the most prestigious group of engineers in the U.S. Publish this journal. And we have about 25 associated journals. IEEE Transactions on Education is one. Chemical Engineering Education is another. Mechanical Engineering Education is another. It's a UK journal. Journal of College Science Teaching is another. The Journal of Engineering Education, of course, is one. Each one of those journals provides an associate editor who reads through the articles in each issue of the journal, and then nominate articles for the Annals of Research on Engineering Education. So there's a set of criteria. Is it systematic? Is it engineering education research? If so, the articles that are nominated are invited to contribute a reflective essay. And these essays are around questions like, well, how did you identify this research area? How did you frame the research question? What theoretical frameworks did you consider and which did you employ and why? What methodological approaches did you consider and which did you employ and why? How did you analyze the data? How did you go about framing your conclusions and recommendations? So the purpose of this journal is to try to unveil the thinking that goes on in doing this kind of work. And we get a very good response rate. It's open. It's part of the National STEM Digital Library Project, so it's funded by National Science Foundation. But it's open to the world, and we think it's a very good resource for people who are thinking about doing research in this area. Because it gets kind of at what you might consider under the floorboards if you think about a car. How do things work? How do you go about doing this kind of work? And because if you're new to this work and you haven't been part of a graduate program, or you've been part of these conversations, getting into this mode of thinking, these are theoretical frameworks that most of us are not all that familiar with from our technical disciplines. They're methodological approaches that are often far different from what we use in our technical disciplines. And so it can be very, very helpful. So each author who accepts does a structured summary, just in case you don't have access to the journal through the library, and then writes a reflective essay on one of those questions that I mentioned. And there have been many, many PhD students, not only in engineering education, but in physics education, chemistry education, biology education, who have been using this as a way to get into this mode of thinking. And I thought it was a really interesting idea. That's a secondary journal. You don't accept articles. You have to have it published somewhere else first. And actually it was a high energy physics area, or was it maybe it was superconducting physics area. It was the first journal of this type, and we've just adopted their model of the invitation process, the structured summary, reflective essay. It also has links to engineering education journals. It has links to conferences, professional societies. It explains a lot of these acronyms. Like any new field or any field in general, it has a language that's unique to this field. It takes some translation. So next, I'd just like to elaborate briefly on what's going on around the world. Here's the engineering education degree granting program in Malaysia at UTM. There are 4 now in the U.S., 4 degree granting programs in engineering education. There are many, many teaching and learning centers in engineering. Most universities have a university-wide teaching and learning center, but an emerging trend is teaching and learning centers that are in the College of Engineering, very specific to engineering. There are also several professional organizations. The European Engineering Education Association, EGIF, which is it's Austrian. There's ANFE, which is the Latin American Engineering Education Association. There's LACSE, which is that's a Latin American, this is Mexican. The Indian Society for Technical Education, the Australasian Engineering Education Association, and many of these engineering education organizations are now developing engineering education research subgroups. So A squared, E squared just developed an engineering education division. 2 special efforts I think that some of you have been involved with. One is the Advancing the Global Capacity for Engineering Education Research. These were sessions that were held around the world trying to get a